we're going to be looking at doing conversions when we have an area or volume, so when we have square units or cubic units. Okay, so I'm just going to remind you, so if I had something like this where it's 1 meter by 1 meter, I'd find that area by going 1 times 1, and it's really 1 meter times 1 meter, and that gives me 1 meter squared. And that's very simple, right? Now, I don't get to simply just say, well, 1 meter squared, if I times by 100, that should give me 100 centimeters squared. I don't actually get to do that. That doesn't work. Okay, this is not allowed. That conversion does not work. Here's why. As I do each side, if this first side was 1 meter, then its equivalence is 100 centimeters. And then if this side is 1 meter, it is also 100 centimeters. So since they're both 100 centimeters, now when I go to find the area, it's 100 centimeters times 100 centimeters, which is really 10,000 centimeters squared. Okay, so it's a different conversion from meter squared to centimeter squared. I don't just get to multiply by 100, and that's because each side needs to convert separately. So it's almost like the conversion is happening twice. Okay, if I was to take the same square, but instead write it as millimeters, so I would have to change from 100 centimeters to 1,000 millimeters and 1,000 millimeters. And that area, when I take 1,000 times 1,000, is going to give me 1,000,000 millimeters squared. Okay, so 1 meter squared is the same thing as 10,000 centimeters squared, and 1 meter squared is also the same thing as 1,000,000 millimeters squared. And this is not the same conversion that we are used to seeing. Okay, and it's because our conversion is happening twice. Okay, so if we have something like this, here we go, we'll draw it in green. So let's say I have a rectangle where we've got 3 meters by 4 meters. And that area then would be 3 times 4, and that gives me 12 meters squared. And I might want to write in my units as I'm going through, right? So 3 meters times 4 meters is 12 meters squared. Okay? But if I was to convert from meters to centimeters, so it's 300 centimeters times 400 centimeters, right? So 300 centimeters times 400 centimeters, and that's going to give me 120,000 centimeters squared. Okay, and that's again because 1 meter squared is the same thing as 10,000 centimeters squared. So I don't just get to times by 100 to convert from meter squared to centimeter squared. I have to times by 100 and then times by 100 again. All right. So same thing works even if we are working in imperial units instead of metric. So let's say I had a square foot, right? You're often going to hear about the square footage of your house or something like that. So I got 1 foot by 1 foot, so the area would be 1 foot squared. Okay, but if I was to change my measurement, and instead of thinking of it in feet, if I was to think of it as inches, that would be 1 foot is 12 inches. And so my area now is 12 inches times 12 inches, and that gives me 144 inches squared. Okay, so I don't have that conversion where 1 foot squared is 12 inches squared. 1 foot squared is 144 inches squared. Those two are equivalent to one another. Okay, so if you're finding square footage in your house, and let's say you had a rectangle measuring, I don't know, we'll say 2 feet by 4 feet, although I don't know why you're measuring that in your house because it's tiny. The area of this would be 2 feet times 4 feet, and that's 8 feet squared. Okay, I cannot just simply multiply that by 12 to get my inches squared. And that's because 2 feet in inches is 24 inches, and 4 feet in inches is 48 inches. And when I take 24 inches and I times by 48 inches, that gives me 1,152 inches squared. And you'll find that if you were to take your 8 and you multiply by that 144 we had from the last one, you'll get the same thing. Okay, so when you're doing these conversions, you really have two options. Okay, so option one is simply convert before you find the areas. Okay, or volume, because we're going to look at cubic units after this. Okay, so that's our first option, is just convert everything before we start working with it. Okay, now option two, if you don't want to do the conversion right away, then you can perform the conversion twice. Now I'm going to put that twice here. I'm going to put it in some quotation marks. It works twice if we are doing area, but if we are doing volume, we must do it thrice, or 3 times. And that's because our units are then cubed, which means each side would have had to have been multiplied to its other, or converted to its other unit. So there would be 3 sides to convert, so the conversion must happen 3 times. Okay, so that's where knowing the exponent, or your units and your exponent on your units, becomes helpful. Okay, so if I was to look at something like let's say I've got something that's 2 meters by 7 meters, and I want to know the area in centimeters squared. Okay, so I'll show you how we can do the conversion twice, because I know you guys could change 200 and then 700 and multiply it. I know that would work. Okay, so let's say I just went area 2 times 7, and we got 14 meters squared. And what I want to do is I want to get rid of that meters squared, and I want to change it into centimeters squared. Okay, so if we think of our unit analysis, what I have to do is I need to cancel out the meters by putting 1 meter in the bottom, and that gives me 100 centimeters up top. But as I do that cancellation, this exponent up top is a 2, and this one down here right now is a 1. So that's only going to get rid of 1 of my meters from up top, and so I'm going to be left with units that say it would say meters centimeters, and that doesn't make sense because that's not a unit at all. Okay, I have to do this same thing again. I have to multiply by another conversion factor of centimeters and meters, right? I have to cancel out 2 meters from up top, right? So I have to make sure I have 2 m's in the bottom. Okay, well, it doesn't really make sense to write that out twice. I may as well just square my conversion factor. So if I have units squared, then when I do the conversion, I must square my conversion. So this now becomes 14 meters squared times 10,000 centimeters squared over 1 meter squared. Now my meters squared cancel. I go 14 times 10,000, and I have 140,000 centimeters squared. So you don't need to remember the conversion factor from meters squared into centimeters squared. All you need still is that basic centimeters to meters, and just square that conversion. Okay, so we're going to do something really similar with volume. Okay, so volume, just to show you, so if I have this cube, we'll start off where it's 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. I don't want to write them all out. Volume, length times width times height, so that's 1 meter times 1 meter times 1 meter, and that's 1 meter cubed. Okay, now if I have the exact same cube where it's the same size as it was before, 1 meter is now the same thing as 100 centimeters. So my volume is 100 centimeters times 100 centimeters times 100 centimeters, and that means that my volume is 1 million centimeters cubed. So I don't just times by 100, right? I have to times by 100 3 times, because each side gets converted. So the conversion is happening 3 separate times. So 1 meter cubed is 1 million centimeters cubed. Okay, same thing would go if we were working in imperial. Okay, so let's say I had 1 foot cubed. Okay, where everything in that cube is 1 foot. That's 1 foot times 1 foot times 1 foot, and that's 1 foot cubed. Well, that same cube, which is a foot by a foot by a foot, if I change those measurements now instead to inches, and I have 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches, when I multiply 12 by 12 by 12, that gives me 1,728 inches cubed. Now chances are you're not going to remember that conversion factor, that 1 foot cubed is 1,728 inches cubed, right? But I can always find it by using my unit analysis. So if I have feet cubed, I want to cancel out my feet. I know 1 foot is 12 inches, and I just need to make sure I do that conversion 3 times because I'm in cubic units. Okay, so that's converting back and forth. Now we can do the exact same thing working with metric to imperial or imperial to metric. Okay, why don't we go from imperial to metric, because that'll work a little bit nicer. We'll have some nicer values to work with. So let's say I have an inch cubed. 1 inch, 1 inch, and 1 inch. So that volume is 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch. And that's 1 inch cubed. All right. Same size cube. Right? Convert each one. So 1 inch is 2.54 centimeters. And I've got that on all 3 sides. So I have 2.54 centimeters times 2.54 centimeters times 2.54 centimeters. Okay, or if we were thinking about it as unit analysis, we have 1 inch cubed, and I'm going to say that 1 inch is the same thing as 2.54 centimeters, and I need to cube that conversion, so that means I need to do it 3 times. And when I go 2.54 times 2.54 times 2.54, looks awful, but it's 16.38764 centimeters cubed. Okay, so I can still do conversions back and forth between metric and imperial. Again, probably easier to just convert everything before we multiply, but if you don't, you can always do the conversion after. Just make sure you do it the appropriate number of times. So you really need to be writing down your units. Okay, all right, that's converting back and forth. Hopefully that makes sense.